The inmate who outsmarted death row. The night they came for him. Before we dive in, hit subscribe if you think you can handle the kind of true crime stories that leave your heart racing and your mind questioning everything you thought you knew about justice. Because tonight's story isn't just about crime, it's about survival inside a system designed to break you. It was a humid Alabama night, June 1985. The air in Birmingham was heavy, thick with the kind of silence that only comes before something terrible happens. The city was still recovering from its dark past, racial tension simmered beneath the surface, and for people like Anthony Ray Hinton, that tension was a noose waiting to tighten. At 29 years old, Hinton was just an ordinary man working at a local supermarket warehouse. He was quiet, reserved, and known for his sense of humor. He had never been in trouble with the law. But in the deep south of the 1980s, innocence wasn't always protection, it was sometimes irrelevant. That night, two men had been found dead, both victims of separate robberies at fast food restaurants. The crimes were brutal, cold, and seemingly random. The killer had used the same gun in both shootings, walking into the establishments late at night and shooting the employees execution style before taking the cash. By dawn, fear had already taken hold of Birmingham. The police were under pressure, two white men dead, no suspect in sight, and a community demanding justice. And then, without warning, they came for Hinton. At 9 a.m., Hinton was mowing his mother's lawn when unmarked police cars pulled up to the house. Officers poured out, their hands already resting on their holsters. Anthony Ray Hinton, one of them barked. He looked up, confused, sweat glistening on his forehead. "Yes, sir," he answered. "You're under arrest for 2 counts of capital murder." The words hit him like a punch. His mother ran from the porch, screaming that her son hadn't done anything. But it didn't matter. They were already cuffing him. Inside the police car, as they drove him downtown, Anthony asked the officer, "Why are you arresting me?" The cop didn't turn around. He just said, "You fit the description." At the Birmingham Police Department, detectives laid out photos of the crime scenes, blood on tiled floors, bullet holes in walls, and the terrified faces of the victims frozen in black and white evidence shots. Hinton sat there, staring in disbelief. "I didn't do this," he said quietly. The lead detective, a tall man with sharp features and a cold stare, leaned across the table. "We found the murder weapon." "Your mother's gun." Anthony frowned. "My mother's gun? It's been in the house for years, it doesn't even work." But that didn't matter. They had their narrative, and it was too convenient to let go. He was a black man. The victims were white. The murders had gone unsolved for weeks. Someone needed to pay. The trial came quickly, too quickly. Anthony's court-appointed attorney was a sleepy, unprepared man who admitted he wasn't ready for a capital murder case. "We don't have the funds to hire an expert," he said, shrugging when Anthony begged him to challenge the state's ballistics test. The prosecution claimed the bullets found at the 2 crime scenes matched his mother's old revolver. But the gun had been rusting in a drawer for years. It was a laughable claim, if anyone had cared to check. The jury, 12 white faces staring back at him, barely deliberated. Within hours, they returned a verdict. Guilty. The courtroom went silent. Anthony stood there, numb, as the judge read his sentence. Death by electrocution. His mother cried out. Anthony turned to her and whispered, "Don't you worry, Mama. They've made a mistake. God knows the truth." But as guards led him away, even he felt the weight of what had just happened. He wasn't being sent to prison, he was being sent to die. Holman Correctional Facility sat deep in the Alabama countryside, surrounded by razor wire and the ghosts of men who never came out alive. Known among inmates as the House of Pain, it was home to the state's death chamber. The moment the iron doors closed behind him, Hinton knew he'd entered another world, a place where time didn't move forward, it only repeated. Every day was the same. The same cold food. The same narrow hallway. The same metal clanging of the cell doors. His new home was a 5-by-7-foot box. Concrete walls. No window. A single light bulb that never truly went out. And 54 steps away, the execution room. He could hear it when someone was taken there. The shuffle of feet. The distant hum of electricity. The silence that followed. Every time, he'd whisper a prayer. "Lord, help the next one." Because one day, it might be him. For the first few years, Anthony lived in despair. He watched men around him lose their minds, some screaming through the night, others laughing at shadows. He stopped talking. He stopped hoping. He only thought about the day they'd come for him. But one morning, something changed. He woke up to find sunlight leaking through a crack in the ceiling. For the first time, he noticed it. That tiny, golden light cutting through the dark. He realized that even here, in this forgotten corner of the world, there was still something no one could take from him, his mind. He began to read whatever books the prison library would allow. He started writing letters, hundreds of them, to lawyers, journalists, anyone who might listen. Most never replied. But it didn't matter. Writing kept him sane. He made friends with the inmates in nearby cells, including one man who'd killed his own family. Hinton never judged them. Instead, he made them laugh. He told jokes every night through the bars. It was his rebellion against the darkness. If they're gonna kill me, he'd say, they'll have to kill my joy too. And I ain't giving them that. Years turned into decades. Evidence that could have cleared him was long buried, his appeals denied again and again. The system had forgotten him, until 1998, when a young lawyer named Bryan Stevenson read his case file. Stevenson, founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, saw something the courts had ignored. The state's entire case rested on one piece of evidence, the so-called ballistic match. And even that looked suspicious. He visited Hinton on death row. When the guard opened the steel door, Hinton stood tall, smiling as if he were welcoming an old friend. "You must be Mr. Stevenson," he said. "You're late. I've been waiting 30 years. Bryan smiled, but inside, he felt the weight of what he'd just stepped into. He'd seen wrongful convictions before, but this was different. As he left the prison that day, one thought kept echoing in his mind: the state of Alabama might have sentenced the wrong man to die. But the truth was about to come at a price. The deeper Stevenson dug, the more resistance he faced, from prosecutors, from the court, even from the local police department. Every piece of evidence led to another dead end, until one single test, revealed something that made his heart stop. The bullets that had sent Anthony Ray Hinton to death row didn't match his mother's gun at all. And that was just the beginning. The man who fought the system from a cage. When attorney Bryan Stevenson left Holman Correctional Facility that day, the Alabama sun burned against his windshield, but his thoughts were darker than the highway ahead. He'd seen injustice before, but something about Anthony Ray Hinton's case gnawed at him. The evidence was too thin, too perfect, too convenient. A man's life was hanging on a single claim, that bullets from 2 murders matched an old revolver found in a dusty drawer at Hinton's mother's home. But Stevenson knew ballistics could be manipulated, especially when the state's expert had never even used proper equipment. So, he did what the original defense never did. He found real experts. Inside death row, Anthony's days bled into nights. Every sound carried a story: the slamming of steel, the coughing of sick inmates, the occasional laughter echoing down the hall. He marked time not by calendars, but by executions. Each time the guards came for someone, the lights flickered. The block went silent. A few hours later, the air felt heavier. Another soul gone. He learned to cope by turning his mind into a world of its own. He played chess with an imaginary opponent. He recited jokes to the walls. He sang old soul songs until his throat went dry. "I may be caged," he once told another inmate, "but my mind still walks free." What the guards didn't know was that every day, behind those gray walls, Anthony was studying law books, legal precedents, every appeal he could find. He didn't have a college degree, but after 20 years on death row, he could argue case law better than half the attorneys in Alabama. Still, hope was a dangerous thing in Holman. Too much of it could drive a man mad. In 2001, after years of silence, Anthony received a letter stamped with the logo of the Equal Justice Initiative. It was from Stevenson. "We're taking your case," it read. "And we're going to prove the state got it wrong." Anthony didn't cry, he laughed. A deep, uncontrollable laugh that echoed down the hallway, confusing everyone around him. For the first time in decades, someone believed him. Stevenson hired 3 of the country's top forensic firearm experts. They ran new tests, examined every bullet, every scratch, every groove. And their conclusion was absolute. The bullets from the murders did not come from Hinton's mother's gun. It was the proof they needed. But when Stevenson presented it to the Alabama courts, the response was ice cold. The same prosecutors who convicted Hinton refused to admit a mistake. The same judge who'd sentenced him refused to reopen the case. Every appeal hit a wall of bureaucracy and pride. And so, the truth sat buried, just like the man it could save. By 2004, nearly 20 years after his conviction, Anthony's patience had worn thin. He'd watched friends executed for crimes they didn't commit. He'd seen the system chew men alive and call it justice. But he never let the bitterness win. Instead, he found purpose. He became the block's counselor, preacher, and comedian. When new inmates arrived trembling, he'd talk them through the first night. When others lost hope, he'd tell stories, make them laugh, remind them that even condemned men could find light. "You can lock up my body," he said once, standing at his bars, "but you can't cage the truth. The truth will walk right through these walls one day." And somewhere beyond those walls, Bryan Stevenson was still fighting to make that happen. In 2009, Stevenson brought the case to a higher court, the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals. He presented the forensic findings, the flawed testimony, the lack of any physical evidence tying Hinton to the crimes. He even revealed that the ballistics expert used by the prosecution was partially blind in one eye and admitted he'd struggled to use the equipment properly. But the judges barely listened. The motion was denied. Again. When Stevenson called Hinton to break the news, there was a long silence on the phone. Finally, Anthony said, "Tell me something, Brian. When the truth isn't enough, what's left?" Stevenson didn't answer. He couldn't. That year, another man on death row, a close friend of Hinton's, was executed. The night before, they talked for hours through the bars. "Ray," his friend whispered, "you keep fighting. Don't let them win. Don't let them forget you." The next morning, the lights flickered. The hum of the generator began. And then, silence. Anthony sat on his cot, staring at the ceiling, whispering, "One day, I'll walk out of here. And I'll walk for you." In 2012, nearly 3 decades after his arrest, Brian Stevenson made one last move. He filed the case with the U.S. Supreme Court, the highest authority in the nation. It was a long shot. Few death row inmates ever made it that far. Inside Holman, Anthony didn't even know if he'd live to see the outcome. His health was failing. His mother had passed away years earlier, she never got to see him free. He kept her photo taped to the wall beside his cot. Every morning, he'd look at it and whisper, "I'm still fighting, Mama." And then, one cold morning in 2015, the guards came to his cell. He thought it was another search. Another routine check. But this time, their expressions were different. "Pack up your things, Hinton," one of them said quietly. He frowned. "Why?" The guard hesitated, then said, "You're going home." The U.S. Supreme Court had ruled unanimously, 9-0, that Anthony Ray Hinton had been wrongly convicted. The state's case was built on unreliable evidence. His right to a fair trial had been violated. After 30 years on death row for a crime he never committed, Anthony Ray Hinton was free. When the gates of Holman opened, sunlight hit his face for the first time in decades. He raised his hands to the sky and laughed, a deep, shaking laugh that sounded more like release than joy. Reporters waited outside. Cameras clicked. Microphones crowded him. Someone asked, "What's the first thing you want to do?" He smiled. "I just want a hamburger. And I want to see the sky without bars." But freedom wasn't simple. He'd entered prison at 29. He left at 58. The world had changed, cell phones, internet, cars that talked back. Everything moved faster, noisier. People stared at him like a ghost. A man back from the dead. At night, he couldn't sleep in a bed. It felt too soft. Too open. He'd wake up expecting to see concrete walls. To hear the sound of metal doors slamming shut. The state of Alabama never apologized. Never admitted wrong. He received no compensation for the years stolen from him. But Anthony didn't waste his freedom on anger. He began speaking publicly, traveling across the country with Brian Stevenson, sharing his story. He told people what it was like to live 30 years waiting to die, and how faith and laughter had saved him. "The same system that tried to kill me," he said, "made me stronger. You can't hate the world and heal at the same time. You choose one." Yet even as he smiled for cameras, something haunted him. A quiet truth he carried like a scar. Because during those 30 years, in the cell next to his, another man had confessed, whispered through the wall that he, not Hinton, had committed one of the murders. The confession had never been recorded, never proven. The man was executed in 2002. Taking the truth with him. And sometimes, when the nights grew still, Anthony would close his eyes and hear that voice again, drifting from the dark. "They'll never believe you, Ray. They never believed us. But justice has a long memory." What no one knew was that one piece of evidence from the original crime, something overlooked, mislabeled, forgotten, was still out there. And when it finally resurfaced, it would reveal that Hinton wasn't the only one wrongfully convicted in Birmingham. Because someone else had been using the same gun. The bullet that spoke. The year was 2016. Anthony Ray Hinton had been free for a year, but inside, part of him was still walking those narrow death row corridors. Freedom was strange, too loud, too bright, too fast. Every honking car, every flickering light reminded him of something from the prison he left behind. But despite the nightmares, he kept moving forward. He spoke in schools, universities, and churches, telling anyone who would listen that the justice system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as it was built. Broken for some, protected for others. And then, one night after a speaking event in Montgomery, his phone rang. It was Brian Stevenson. "Ray," he said, his voice tense, "something's come up. You might want to sit down." Anthony chuckled. "Brian, I've been sitting for 30 years. Just tell me." At the Birmingham Police Department's evidence storage facility, a clerk had been auditing old case files slated for disposal. Among them, a dusty cardboard box marked, "Hinton Case, 1985, had surfaced. Inside was a small sealed bag containing a single spent bullet casing from the first fast food murder, the one used to tie Hinton to the weapon. It shouldn't have existed. According to official records, all ballistic evidence had already been tested and logged decades earlier. But this casing had a different signature. Stevenson arranged for independent forensic analysts to examine it. When the results came back, they were explosive. The casing didn't match the revolver at all. It didn't match any gun in evidence. Instead, it was linked to a weapon connected to another unsolved string of robberies in Birmingham during the same period. Robberies that had been quietly closed due to lack of leads. Someone else had been out there. Someone who'd kept killing. Stevenson called the district attorney's office the next day, demanding a meeting. When he walked into that conference room, he carried the same quiet fire that had freed Hinton a year earlier. Across the table sat the same prosecutor who'd once said, "We're confident we got the right man." Stevenson placed the casing report on the table. "Read it," he said. The prosecutor hesitated. His eyes moved over the paper, his jaw tightening as the truth sank in. "You put an innocent man on death row," Stevenson said. "And the real killer walked free." The room fell silent. For a long time, no one spoke. Then the prosecutor leaned back and whispered, "We had no idea." Stevenson stared at him. "You didn't want to know." Meanwhile, Hinton continued his quiet mission, visiting former inmates, helping others still fighting wrongful convictions. He'd learned to forgive, but he hadn't forgotten. He carried a small notebook everywhere he went, jotting down names, dates, and fragments of stories he heard from the men he once lived beside. He planned to write a book, not just about his life, but about everyone trapped in that concrete graveyard. Then Stevenson told him about the bullet. Hinton froze. "You mean, after all that, they still had the wrong gun?" "They never had the right one," Stevenson replied. "And that casing, it connects to other murders, committed after you were already locked up." Anthony's face hardened. "So while I was on death row, waiting to die, the real killer was still out there, living." The new evidence led to a quiet federal review. Old files were reopened. Case numbers resurfaced that hadn't been touched in 30 years. One name appeared again and again: Carl Jennings, a small-time burglar from the same neighborhood as Hinton, arrested in 1986 for unrelated robberies but released after serving only 2 years. Jennings had died in 2003 in a car crash, but his criminal record and known possession of a revolver matching the ballistic pattern made him the likely true shooter. It wasn't official, no charges could ever be filed, but the pattern was undeniable. For Anthony, the revelation didn't bring satisfaction. It brought silence. He sat on his porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, and whispered, "That man took lives, and then the system tried to take mine." He paused. Maybe we both died in there, just different ways. A year later, Anthony Ray Hinton released his memoir, The Sun Does Shine. It became a bestseller, read by millions who'd never imagined what it meant to live 3 decades in a cage for someone else's crime. He spoke before Congress, standing beneath the marble columns of the Capitol, a man who had once been a number in a death row file now lecturing the lawmakers who'd allowed it. "The death penalty isn't justice," he said. "It's revenge. And revenge doesn't care who's innocent." The room was silent. Cameras clicked. And for a fleeting moment, even the lawmakers couldn't look away. But the story doesn't end there. In 2019, another inmate in Alabama, convicted on similarly weak ballistic evidence, had his case reopened after citing the Hinton precedent. His conviction was overturned. Within 3 years, 6 more cases were re-examined. The domino effect had begun. One man's survival had cracked open a system built to destroy. And yet, for every man freed, dozens more remained behind bars, waiting for someone to believe them too. Anthony once said in an interview, "When you sit on death row, you stop fearing death. What you fear is being forgotten." He smiled faintly. "So I made sure they'd remember my name." Late one night, years after his release, Hinton visited the old prison grounds with Stevenson. Holman Correctional had been decommissioned. The execution chamber stood empty, dust covering the floor. Anthony stepped inside the small, cold room where he'd once expected to die. The air still smelled faintly of metal and oil. He ran his fingers along the wooden armrest of the electric chair. "This thing was supposed to kill me," he said softly. "But it only made me stronger." He turned to Stevenson, his voice steady. "You know what's funny? They built this room to take life, but somehow, it gave me one." Outside, the sky was streaked with red and gold. Anthony stood quietly, staring at the horizon. He thought about his mother, about the men he'd left behind, about the laughter that had kept him sane through the darkest nights. And for a brief, perfect moment, he smiled, not the smile of a man who'd escaped death, but of one who'd outwitted it. Because in the end, death row didn't kill Anthony Ray Hinton. He killed death row, with truth. And somewhere, in an old storage locker in Birmingham, a forgotten case file still sits, its paper yellowed, its corners torn, marked with a faded word stamped in red ink. Closed. But for those who know what really happened, the story is far from over. Because if one man could outsmart death itself, what else might still be waiting in the shadows of America's prisons? If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for what's coming next. Subscribe, because the next case might just make you question everything you thought justice meant.